Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the leftist Christian podcast that is one man down this afternoon, but we also have Jonny returning. Jonny, where have you been?
Lost in North Norfolk. Working very, very hard.
We are also joined today by Professor Oli Mould. Oli, how are you? Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm delighted to be here.
We are going to talk today a little bit about epistemology, which is a slightly scary sounding word, but we will define that at some point. And Oli is here to help us talk about that. And part of the reason I thought you'd be a really good guest for it is because I've seen a lot of your TikToks. And I think you have to have a decent grasp of epistemology to say the things that you say on TikTok.
That's very kind of you to say. I'm not entirely sure it's true, having seen some of your TikToks as well. But it's funny. I mean, it is an interesting one because, funnily enough, just the other day I was having I did a master's showcase where we have to sort of try and sell all our wonderful master's courses. And we have people...
the university, the commodification of higher education is great, isn't it?
Well, don't get me started. That's an entirely different podcast about the crisis in the university sector, which has obviously been caused by marketization. But yes, we have to sort of try and beat our chests and sell these master's programs. But we get a range of different people because at undergraduate level, if you're doing geography at A level, you go on and do geography at undergraduate level. But when you go off and do a master's in human geography, we get social anthropologists, we get philosophers, we even have an electrical engineer. So there's lots of different kinds. So when you get to sort of that stage of it, everything bleeds into everything else. And so things like social theory, epistemology, ontology, all these different kinds of philosophical ideas, they all get swept up in this broad scheme of sort of social science at the postgraduate level. So,
Yeah, and you sort of have to have a decent grasp on most of these ideas in order to actually talk about the things that are adjacent to that.
Exactly.
And it's almost like the Victorian compartmentalizing of different subjects is not actually all that helpful.
Well, this is it. Absolutely. That's how the universities sort of started, wasn't it? When the philosophers and the engineers didn't really get on. So they just decided to create their own institutions. And here we are millennia later.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that really the only science, the queen of the sciences, indeed, is theology. So let's do a bit of mind grapes, shall we?
What else is on my mind grapes?
I don't know if anyone else has anything on their mind grapes. Ollie, you're looking at me like you've just had a massive surprise.
This disembodied voice, which sounded incredibly authoritative. I was saying, being on a theology podcast, I was wondering whether this is something you've managed to tap into the...
It's the voice of God.
It turns out he speaks like I don't know who this person is, but it sounded sort of someone from the Bronx. So it was, which might well end up being quite poetic. But there we go.
If Ben was here, this would be the moment where he explained his spiel about who this was. It's someone off some American sitcom type thing that's apparently very funny, but I haven't seen it at this point quite deliberately. So I have no idea what it's about. It could be something awful and reactionary, and Ben's just that this is like a blind spot for him or something. I don't know, but
ignorance is bliss. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah. That's why I did theology. No, right. What else is on my mind grapes? Jonny, have you got anything on your mind grapes?
Well, actually, there is one thing that I could talk about thinking about it, is the VAT stuff for churches and reclaiming it back, the scheme for that.
Oh, this sounds super interesting.
Well, it has an impact on mission and things, because if you can't reclaim it, I can talk about it later. Or not at all.
No, I wasn't trying to put you off. I was only making a joke there, Jonny. Like, you can talk about VAT if that's the kind of thing you're into.
But no, it's more like so obviously the government are slashing lots and lots of different things, and one of the things is the sort of reclaiming VAT for various things for churches. And one of my churches has, in sort of round figures, £1 million building project. So if we don't do it, like, the building will fall down, kind of thing. Sort of 160-year-old building, but it has increased our costs by about 180 grand, which is really tricky. And so we're having to apply for a lot more funding, but that obviously will have a knock-on effect on other things, and actually will impact like what we can do with the community, because we're going to have to divert resources elsewhere. And it's not a very well-off church anyway, and most of that money is having to come from the lottery fund. But yeah, it's interesting. But Church of England, along with others, are pushing forward, along with Methodist Church as well, and kind of trying to say, well, actually, this will have serious impact and consequences, particularly as most of the voluntary sector in the UK comes from people working in churches, and actually that will also be affected. So there's this kind of unintended sort of domino effect that ends up happening.
I don't know if I have come to a position on whether I think churches should be exempt from tax. I think probably there are some churches I should be exempt, think should be exempt, and some that shouldn't be. So that's perhaps my own bias. But yeah, even so, this is a sort of example of a government cutting or tweaking a system and having potentially unintended consequences. It's quite short-sighted. It reminds me a lot of, you know, the coalition government coming in, and it's not the same thing, but getting rid of, well, cutting everywhere really.
It reminds me the obviously the recent cuts to the disabled benefits that the Labour government, just remind ourselves that it is a Labour government, have announced.
Is it really?
I think that's debatable, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, we can. There's obviously lots of parties throughout history which have had very oxymoronical names, but no, it's and one of the ways in which the unintended consequences, or maybe it's intended, I don't know, but if you narrow the criteria for the personal independence payments, the PIPs, then obviously that has a knock-on effect of the carer's allowance, because you can only claim carer's allowance for if the person you are caring for is a recipient of PIP, and so it has this sort of knock-on effect, and so it does spread through the society. So in terms of, it's not just the sort of the initial people that get hurt as much as they are. It kind of does end up rippling through. Yes, so there we go. Yeah.
There was a brilliant TikTok video that I saw yesterday, I think, that was talking about austerity and cuts and that kind of thing, and it just did this wonderful thing where it started off with these two people, you know, one pretending to be a politician, one pretending presumably to be a civil servant, and then the politician saying, we need to save money, so we're going to pay teachers less, and the civil servant, oh, excellent idea. And then it cuts to two more people, and it's the teacher at home and the husband saying, oh, I didn't get that pay rise, oh, now we're not going to be able to afford this. And then the knock-on effect of that is two other people saying, oh, well, we haven't got enough money coming into the shop for this, so you can't have as many hours. And then it eventually tracks back all the way back to the politician and the civil servant saying, we have even less money coming in, why? It's very short-sighted.
There's a Bluey episode that does about something very similar. And
that surprised
me, actually.
It's fantastic, and I show it to my students sometimes. There's Bluey gets a $10 note, and they pass it around the fair, buying all these goods, and it's the same £10 note or $10 note which comes back to the person, and it's just it shows you, well, look, this is how economies work, and so yes, anyway. So Bluey is anti-capitalist practice.
Yeah, we're Bluey stands on this podcast. Very much not Paw Patrol.
Oh well, Paw Patrol, cops,
propaganda. Yeah.
Bluey. Should have worn my Bluey T-shirt, but Bluey is fantastic. Yeah.
Brilliant. I have many things on my mind grapes this week, but I'm gonna stick with. Well, I'll briefly mention that. And obviously this is generally a sort of fairly light part of the show, but obviously we have to acknowledge that Israel have restarted their bombing campaign of Gaza, murdering hundreds of people. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. We're not going to talk about that properly today, but that is something that has been on my mind grapes. Something a little bit lighter, kind of, that's been on my mind grapes is the football team I used to support won their first trophy in about 60 years or something. So I used to support Newcastle United because I am from the southeast, and so I wanted to support the club that was furthest away. But when they were bought by the Saudi Public Investment Fund, I fairly publicly said, I can't. This is not good. This is the Saudi government. These people behead people in the street. Not that it's better to behead people in other places. It's just, don't behead people. It's not good. So I just sort of said, I can't support this football team anymore until these people are out, even though we see that they're doing good things for the club. But I have really complicated feelings about the fact that they just won the League Cup, because I watched it. I bear in mind, right? So I'm doing Lent, and for Lent, I'm like giving up ultra-processed foods, which is a bit of a weird category because it doesn't really mean anything. But for the League Cup final, I bought like a pizza and crisps and fizzy drink, and I sat down and I watched the whole thing, and I pretended not to be happy for them. But my God, I was like, internally, I was like, yes. And it's so weird because like you can't so easily just shed those feelings, those ideas, even of something as silly as a football club, because the connection to it that you've had for decades, really, it means something, even for someone like me who's not a Geordie. So yeah, that's what's been on my mind grapes. It's been a very sort of weird thing to process. I'm both happy and annoyed.
I've got a very important question for someone who's stereotypically queer. Is the league like the top sort of competition for
it? No, stereotypically queer. So the League Cup is not the league as such. The League Cup is like a cup competition that runs concurrently with the league. And
you say postmodernism's complicated. I mean,
I don't know. It's not that postmodernism is complicated. It's that it's bullshit. But no, it's a really weird thing. There's a lot of complicated feelings, and I think I'm probably not the only one there actually.
Well, I think you're right. I'm a big football fan myself, and as you can tell by my outrageous Scouse accent, I'm an Everton fan, and so I was very happy to see Newcastle beat Liverpool.
Yeah,
because my allegiances. But you're absolutely right. I mean, again, I because I live in Liverpool, there is a sense of distance, but there is, having grown up and supported Everton since I've been a little boy, there's this incredible cultural association. And as a geographer, this is the sort of stuff that fascinates us. This as a tribal imagined communities that we create, and they burrow into your habitus, if you like, and they do kind of gnaw away at you. And I mean, it's not nowhere near as, I guess, if we're talking about hierarchies of evil, then being bought out by the Saudi government is perhaps up there. But Everton's new stadium is being built on their landlords are essentially Peel. I'm not sure if you've heard of the company Peel Holdings, but they're an incredibly large real estate company up in the northwest of England who I've done a lot of work in and around, but they are one of the most disgustingly evil companies in the country. They're just, they own huge tracts of the Manchester Ship Canal, the Salford Quays, the Liverpool Heritage Waterfront, and they're an incredibly obtuse and obfuscatory company. You can't get at them. They're headed up by a guy called Roger Whittaker, who is George Osborne's godfather, which explains a lot. And they're just evil. They're pure evil. I always joke with my students that the next project is going to be the Death Star. But anyway, so Everton have built their new stadium on the Liverpool waterfront, which is owned by Peel. So if I want to go and see them play, which I do regularly at Goodison Park, I'm going to have to
contribute money to.
Well, exactly, indirectly contribute money to Peel. So and when there's a serious point here insofar as that once capitalism strangles football so much that it kind of begins to affect those long-standing habitus and those kinds of really affective registers within us, which is why I go and watch Aldershot play. Non-league side just down the road. So.
The thing is, we invest our time, our money, our lives portions of our lives into this stuff. It's not dissimilar to following your favorite band. It's the same kind of thing. I mean, I always get a little bit annoyed when people, the classic one is people get really annoyed at footballers having obscene wages to kick a ball around a field. And I get that, because the wages are obscene and they shouldn't be. However, you never hear these people say the same thing about actors or musicians. And these days, football is one of the few places where a working class lad or lass can actually work their way up if they're actually genuinely talented. With acting or music, it's a lot rarer these days, because you have to have contacts, you have to have money and that kind of thing. So I always find it really fascinating that people always jump to the thing that is sort of fairly stereotypically working class and have a go at the people who get rich off that, rather than having a go at the people who are already rich and getting richer,
Indeed, it's like it's almost as if they believe in meritocracy, but not when it actually is thrown in their face.
Yeah, exactly. Let's move on to our main topic. Ollie, you are a professor of human geography at is it Royal Holloway, I think?
Correct, Royal Holloway, yes.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you generally are interested in, what you teach about and that kind of thing, and maybe we can move into thinking about what epistemology is and how maybe that might enter into some of the work that you do.
Yes, well, that's a kind invitation. Yes, so human geography is a very broad-ranging social science, I guess, and there's lots of different ways into it, lots of different subdisciplines, cultural geography, economic geography, for example. One of the things I always say to my students straight off the bat is that everything takes place. Everything, all the various issues that we discuss and we can observe in the world takes place. It's a very materialist way of understanding the world, but ultimately, capitalism takes place in various parts of the world. A thought in our brain takes place in the synapses within our skull. And so there's lots of different ways in which we can study the relationship between the thing and place. And ultimately, that's what human geography is. And so you can see why it ends up going down the rabbit holes of various philosophical ideas, including epistemology. Now, I guess grew up is the wrong word, but my bread and butter is the city. I did a lot of work around the city. As my PhD was on urban issues, and I teach around urban geography specifically. But even within that, the city itself is such a complicated and complex site of human practice, behavior, emotion, inequality, all those different things, that the city itself is a fantastic arena for discussing a lot of these kinds of big philosophical ideas, as well as some of the more practical, ground level stuff, such as activism or global city policy directives and things like that. So human geography is a very, very broad church, to use the podcast vernacular, and so it's very much encompassing of everything. And what I find fascinating is it blows my mind all the time, the variety of student dissertation projects, for example. I mean, just the other day I was looking at one that was studying the geographies of a fish tank. And it was this person who had spent a lot of time just watching this fish tank and exploring the different ways in which the humans interacted with the fish, and how the fish themselves navigated the space, and what it did, and what the fish tank did to the atmospheres of the room and the lighting and everything else. And so it has this wonderful ability to narrate the sublime and the big ideas through very, very small things. So, you can narrate. There's some wonderful books that sort of talk about capitalism in its global planetary force through a mushroom, for example, through the production chain of a mushroom. So, that's what human geography is, and that's how it relates to some of the broader philosophical ideas.
Part of the reason I wanted to get you on is because we live in a time now of such profound misinformation. The whole thing around fake news. Is it fake news? Is it you've got people spreading fake news, telling you that other people are spreading fake news, and then they're saying they're spreading fake news, and realistically they're both spreading fake news, but these people over here who nobody's listening to at all are perhaps a bit closer to the truth. So I wanted to get you on because I've seen some of your TikTok videos, and I've always found it really interesting how you frame a lot of your videos, and thought you would be a really helpful dialogue partner. So we're going to sort of have a chat about that. I have noticed, like many people have, that there's a certain demographic of both older and actually now younger men who are falling down a rabbit hole. Starting off with maybe people like Joe Rogan, moving on to people who he has on his podcast like Jordan Peterson, and really being influenced by some quite nefarious ideology. Now, I think someone like Joe Rogan he's not really the big fish in this, I think, because his main role in this is to be the person who sort of facilitates the really nasty voices. But someone like Jordan Peterson is interesting because his trajectory has been someone who sort of started off sort of broadly on the right, and got famous for some transphobic nonsense, but has just really fallen down the rabbit hole himself. It's like he's bought his own propaganda. One of the things that Jordan Peterson talks about is postmodern neo-Marxism. Perhaps we can have a chat about what postmodern neo-Marxism is, if indeed it's anything at all. What does he mean by that, and why is it bullshit?
Well, if that isn't a leading question, I have no idea what it is. It's right in a YouGov polling questionnaire that, but well, it's obviously bullshit. I mean, postmodernism is and of itself a sort of it's a pastiche of a particular movement which happened, I guess you could argue, sometime in the sort of 70s and 80s, and it was around, or even before that, to be fair. And it was an argument which came about mainly through art and through this idea that there was a lack of meaning in the world. And in many respects, it actually started as a critique. It was a sort of critique of some of these stifling issues around modernist thought, hierarchy, rigid ontologies, that sort of thing. And so it was never anything other than just a critical thought. It was never meant as a way of viewing the world. But it has kind of become this, pastiche is a good word, of a sort of movement which has nothing more than simply, for me anyway, a kind of playful viewing of the world. And so that's why it happens in art and in film and in various other cutting edge, if you like, artistic movements. And so it's nothing other than that. It's just a sort of a kind of poking, a sort of subtle light poking fun at some of the big thinkers of the world. And then when you couple it with neo-Marxism, itself a term which obviously is so vague and unuseful. So you're bolting two words together, which are just essentially, they just alert people. They sort of fire various images and atmospheres and affects in people's minds, which, oh yeah, you're talking about the left, or you're talking about ideologies which I don't like. And so it's essentially just a dog whistle, I guess, is the other phrase to use. It's to say that, right, I'm going to be talking about things that you don't like, so get into your angry place, and the next half an hour I'm going to be talking about all these different people and all these different groups of people, and I'm going to frame it in this sort of quasi-intellectual way to make it sound like what I'm talking about has some sort of validity, when really I just don't like trans people, or I don't like black people, and so the next half an hour is just my diatribe. So that's all it is. It's a sort of quasi-intellectual framing of a rant, and that's what he's very good at, and that's kind of where he made his millions, I guess, if he is a millionaire, but where he made his name in this sort of quasi pop culture world. Like Malcolm Gladwell's another one, and who's the other one? Steven Pinker. These people who sort of were intellectuals, but they weren't quite clever enough, and so they ended up writing these sort of pop culture books which appeal to stupid people, and they ended up kind of filling out stadiums of stupid people. So this sounds like a rant myself, but
this is what the podcast is about.
Well, exactly.
Frankly, it's just an extended rant.
So postmodern neo-Marxism is just a collection of words to signal to people that this is what's going to happen. So that's all it is. And
I guess because they're based on half truths, they almost seem real.
Yeah, it's just sort of, if you use big fancy words like that, then you tend to hoodwink people. But yeah, and so it's this pipeline which you talk of is incredibly dangerous, because it does sort of funnel people, like you say, into this very, very dangerous ideology. I think it would be remiss not to talk about the TV channel, the TV show, the Netflix show, which has been shown over the last couple of days, called Adolescence, which your listeners and viewers may well have watched because it has been remarkably popular. I think it's like 30 million views on Netflix in the last 3 or 4 days. And I watched it last night, and it is an incredible piece of television. Not least cinematography. The cinematography is incredible. Every episode is just one long take, and it's been done. There's been no editing. It's all been done.
Sounds exhausting, frankly.
I find
not to watch. I mean, to like film.
Oh well, I mean to film and to watch. The thing about editing and film. Okay, so I got into academia because I'm a bit of a film buff, and I ended up reading one of Deleuze's cinema books.
Oh no, you two are going to get on like a house on fire. Goodness me. I'll just turn my microphone off and shut up for a bit and let you two talk it out, shall I?
Oh, thank goodness for that.
You might need to sort of have another server because this could go on a while. But I mean,
like Deleuze does.
Well, like Deleuze, yeah. So it's so I was a bit of a film. So I ended up reading Cinema 1 and 2, and Deleuze talks about the editing, the ways, and it's quite geographical because he says that it's any place whatsoever. So film can sort of transport you to different places all over the world, and that. And when you're watching a film, it kind of moves you around. That's the beauty of the editing technology, the sort of cinematic technologies that were invented in the 20s. But the long take, and Children of Men is a film I adore, and that film does it very, very well. But there's lots of different ways in which, fantastic. But it kind of, because it doesn't edit, because there is no quick takes, you feel trapped. You feel very claustrophobic, and you don't really know why. And there's really uneasy because you're so used to watching TV and cinema, which cuts. And I do this a bit with I'm not a film studies scholar, but it speaks to the interdisciplinary nature of it. When I do watch some clips with my students, and I get them to clap every time there's an edit, every time there's a change of. And if you're watching some sort of Michael Bay bollocks, you end up in, But if you're watching something good, you're not clapping that often, and so. And obviously, with this Adolescence, you don't clap at all. It's one, and so. And because of the nature of the subject matter is quite intensely emotive, and it requires you to really be intimate with these characters. It's the perfect cinematographic technique. And so anyway, that alone, sort of cinematography, is brilliant. But the content of it is obviously this radicalization of this young boy who goes on to murder a woman, a young girl. So it speaks to this pipeline, and the whole point of this program is like we're letting down our younger men in particular, because of they talk about the fact that the parents weren't there because they had to work 2 different jobs, and they talk you're talking about austerity. I mean, the lack of any kind of public service. Sure Start you mentioned, but also things like swimming pools have been sold off, football pitches. Youth activities after school, extra in school,
library in my hometown.
Exactly. All these places where young people, not just men, but young people in general, over the last 20 years, have been able to forge an identity through a particular activity, in connection with an expert, a coach or a teacher or a crafts leader or something, or a scout leader or whatever it might be, and so. We haven't got that anymore, and so is it any wonder that they're trying to find identity on screens and in manosphere, forums and Reddit and all that sort of stuff, and so I think that austerity shoulders a lot of the blame for this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but there are real questions about what we do about that, as communities, not as individuals. And communities, how do we? I mean, it's 15 years too late, really. But how do we approach that issue of austerity, especially with this latest round of cuts from apparently Labour government? What do we do about that in a way that doesn't actually end up reinforcing the austerity, the cuts that have and propping it up?
No, I agree, and. So I was chatting to a student of mine, and she was recalling a conversation that she had with a friend of hers husband, who had gone down this pipeline, who'd been red-pilled, is the phrase. And she was kind of saying, well, you can't necessarily have a conversation with these people because the defenses go up automatically.
Yeah.
And I think it's in large part because of, and she was admitting her frustration with this, because actually this person, this man, they lived at home with his mother, and he was like, oh, I love my mother. I want to stay here because I want to look after her. So there was a sort of contradiction there to a certain degree. But I think you can't have these conversations because as we see with the MAGA cult and on the broader geopolitical narratives that we've seen over the last couple of months, if you try to argue with these people, it automatically becomes a social media conversation. And that, if you're just sat down over dinner with someone who you're trying to kind of have a conversation with about this, the very act of conversation, the very act of you talking with them suddenly becomes a performative space. It suddenly becomes a space in which that kind of politics is performed.
Yeah.
It doesn't become, and it loses any of the sort of social conditioning that a conversation between friends has down the pub or over dinner or whatever it might be. And so I've had similar conversations with people who perhaps aren't quite as far down, but it's difficult to talk to these people because the moment you even begin the act of conversation, it just to them it's like it's another comment thread, and it's like, oh, who can insult each other the best, and who can kind of ignore each other's, and who can get that one over, and so there's more validity in exploring the material conditions of these people. And I think that that's a really important part. And again, I'll give you another vignette of a TikTok video which I saw. And it's not about the manosphere, but it's of a similar sort of ideal insofar it was a NASA scientist. She was a climatologist from NASA. And the podcast persons asked her, so, well, your dad was a climate denier, and what changed his mind? And she was like, well, I'd like to think that it was his love of his daughter who was doing this amazing work in climate science in NASA. But she said, no, the thing that changed his mind was the fact that his insurance company didn't pay out when his home was destroyed by flooding. And then he subsequently found out that all the insurance companies in America, and indeed beyond that, had climate scientists and climatologists involved in their actuarial science, in their decision making. And so his argument was, oh, well, if it's good enough for capitalism and insurance companies, if they're taking this climate stuff seriously and it's factoring into their insurance and payout things, then it must be true. And so her argument was that it was his material conditions and the sort of structures which he was very, very reliant upon. Once he realized that they had the sort of were treating climate change as truth, then he began to change his mind. And so I think that there's a real nugget of important information there. Is that, I mean, the upshot of that is that, well, we have to wait for their material conditions to worsen before they begin to change their minds, which is obviously not good because it means putting them into destitution. But I think that at this stage, like you say, with post-truths and all these other horrific postmodern neo-Marxism and all these other things which are floating around it, until people's material conditions worsen, like the prices of eggs rocket, then it won't make a jot of difference.
What I'm hearing from this is that it will be capitalist insurance companies that save the world. That's what I've taken from that. I don't know if that's what you intended, but
well, it isn't what I intended. But well, yeah, that's the postmodernist in you, Adam, coming.
Okay. I retract it all.
Yeah.
I guess, there's something about those material conditions, because what a lot of the sort of MAGA and essentially fascistic ideologies sort of get at, they're touching that nerve of you're suffering and your material conditions are bad, but they keep poking at it and saying, oh, it's that person over there who's poking it and causing you to hurt, not us. But as soon as the sort of almost that veil is kind of taken away, going behind the curtain of the Wizard of Oz and realizing, actually, oh, it's you. You're not actually that thing.
I mean, I think there's only so long that Donald Trump can blame Biden for the worsening material conditions. I mean, he will try, and I suspect there'll be a large number of people that will believe him. But I think that hopefully there's enough people that don't and realize that, actually, maybe fascism isn't all that good. And so ultimately what it comes down to is it's a battle of the material world. I mean, that comes back to classic Marxist a Marxist epistemology, I guess, in that respect. But yeah, it's bleak, but it's certainly a one avenue of kind of thinking through this.
I think one of the kind of concerning things about this is that, like, a person doesn't have to be fully sold out on Trump. They don't have to be a Trump supporter for this stuff to actually have an effect on them, because the way a lot of this stuff works is that you throw out so much bullshit that you are just completely muddying the waters and people don't know what to think. So I know people who don't like Trump, don't support Trump, but they definitely believe things without realizing it that have been put in there by Trump or Trump's, Trump adjacent kind of people, that have meant that they have no idea what they're supposed to be thinking, what they want to think, and who's saying what and why, and no idea how ideology is functioning. And I think this is why it's helpful for us to have a strong grasp on a theory of knowledge that can help us pick through some of this stuff. So I wonder whether we should talk a little bit about a Marxist epistemology. What does that kind of look like?
Well, I think it would fall back on a kind of dialectical materialist view of the world, insofar as history is moved forward by particular struggles, and particular, in Marx's case, obviously class struggle. And so a Marxist epistemology would be one which understands that the material conditions of life are incredibly important, but they're not set. There is no sort of, there is no end game here, at least, although, I guess the communist horizon is one which he would probably move us towards. But it's, there's always going to be a sort of debate to be had, or there's always going to be a kind of a conflicting ideology which will change those material conditions. And so I don't know, I didn't want to lean on the idea of kind of optimism and pessimism, or hope and despair, but I think that there is a sense that you can always try and change those conversations by appealing to, the material conditions of people's lives, and say, look, your lives have got worse. You are no better off than your parents were. You can't afford a house. Your school has got a crumbling roof. And so there is a tangible reality in front of your eyes which suggests the current ideologies of this world are simply not working. They simply do not serve you as a person, marginalized person, working class, but whatever it ends up being. But you can change those conditions. You have agency insofar as you are part of a collective, a body politic, whatever kind of word you want to use, that can change those conditions. You can change the political ideology either through non-violent political means, through changing governments, or through, revolution, which is obviously where Marx was trying to get us towards. So I think that those messages need to sort of be heard, because there's a lot of despair and a lot of people kind of throwing, particularly around climate change. What do we do now? So a Marxist epistemology would be one that, you do have agency, you do have the ability to change your material conditions. But yeah, that doesn't negate the fact that requires a huge amount of work and resources, which obviously none of us have at the moment.
I think as well, like, even when we talk about material conditions, when you think about that, that makes perfect sense. But I think to a lot of people, even that kind of phrase is not necessarily something that they've thought about in those terms before. People don't. People do think about material conditions, but they don't necessarily know that they're thinking about material conditions. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, it does perfectly. Yeah. I think it's it's in some respects it's slightly easier, if that's the right word, to think about in today's interconnected, particularly climate-riddled world. Climate deniers notwithstanding, I think that the vast majority of people will understand that climate catastrophe is a thing, and one of the major explainers of that is that, well, it's infinite growth on a finite planet, and that is one of the reasons in which climate is changing, is because we have extracted far too much material out of the world and out of the ground, and we are burning it to such on the altar of profitability. And so you could actually point to a real kind of tangible climate material and say, well, look, the current capitalist ideology has created this worsening material world. The floods and heat waves and the wildfires and everything else. And so I think that there is that. And so you can point to the issues around climate change to show how ideology is linked to material. And interestingly, I find it fascinating that when anyone strays beyond the climate change agenda to say what becomes an anti-capitalist, for example, Greta Thunberg, they get immediately pushed out of the media. It's like, she was wonderful. She had all these book tours and TV shows when she was, let's change, let's all stop using plastic straws and doing all this. The moment she became an advocate for anti-capitalism and indeed Palestinian rights, the moment she started making all these links together, that's it. She was out. She was like, that's it. No more BBC talk shows for you, young lady. So it's you're battling against the media framework, which obviously wants to keep everything separate, wants to keep everything kind of in its box. But there are ways around that, such as your podcast, for example.
And what you were saying there reminds me of how with things like various climate activists, whether they're protesting in shops and just getting in people's way or stopping people from going through roads and whatnot, people get really irritated with the fact that they're doing that thing rather than going, yes, this is calling us to think about the climate and we're heading towards catastrophe. And it's, again, the media like to compartmentalize all these different things.
Yeah, and it's classic. I mean, part of that wider divide and conquer technique. But yes, and so when this, going back to your question, Adam, about material, that what does it mean? It's like you can point to different parts of it. I mean, the cost of living is another one. And this is why I think that people, I've seen on Blue Sky and other social media how Bernie Sanders and AOC in the States at the moment are going around trying to whip up people with sort of saying, oh, it's against oligarchy, or a kind of, there's, and it's really catching on from what I can see, at least, insofar as that they're actually saying to Republicans and people who are fairly far right, look around you, like you're not getting it, your life isn't getting any better. It's purely about people's lives, and like they are getting worse. And so that's why that is gaining a lot of traction, because maybe it is because Elon Musk is the richest guy in the world and he's got 478 billion pounds or whatever it is. So I think that there is a sense that pointing to that is a way to cut through.
I think we're going to move on for a moment and talk about our Saint of the Week.
Saint of the Week.
Yes, we have a jingle for everything.
Where were you earlier, Johnny? You said you were in North Norfolk.
I am indeed.
So
I live in.
I apologise for presumably all these jingles. It reminds me of Alan Partridge and the Mid Morning Matters. North Norfolk Digital, and it's right up my alley. It's perfect.
Excellent.
I was so happy when the software that we were using got a soundboard. It's I don't know if I'm just showing my age a little bit or what's going on, but I feel like it's very uncool, and I like it for that.
That the uncool is now cool, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and Adam is very old, so
you're older than me.
I'm 43, and what I have found is that no one told me this, but in your 40s, for some reason, I now really enjoy just standing at my window and staring into the garden for no good reason.
I do that already, and well, I'm only a few years younger than you, so I'm a bit premature, but not far off.
Yeah, I don't, it's weird. I mean, I quite like it, but obviously, I had no idea that was a thing. You just sort of stand and stare for ages.
Let's talk about our Saint of the Week this week. Our Saint of the Week this week is Edo Fiman. Now, this is Ben's choice. Ben couldn't join us today. He got called away at the last minute. So he sent me through this information about this guy. So I've had to very quickly, before we started, read up as much as I could about him. And he seems pretty cool, to be fair. So he was a Dutch trade unionist who was born in 1881, died in 1942. And he went to Amsterdam Trade Public School, where he had a talent for languages and worked as a translator. And ultimately, later on, he becomes interested in Christianity and at a similar time becomes interested in anarchism. So he sort of is a Christian anarchist who is also kind of working with a lot of other kinds of socialists as well, because his big thing really is that he's very much into the trade unionist movement. One of the things about Saint of the Week is that nobody's perfect, and we don't expect people to be perfect, but there are also kind of grey areas where I don't quite know how this guy conceptualized some of this stuff. But one of the things he was particularly interested in for a time was kind of purity stuff. So he campaigned against things like prostitution, or sex work, sorry. That was one of his big things. And I can't find much about what that looked like for him, but that was one of the things that he campaigned against. He contributed to a magazine that means, I don't know how to say this word, it's like Vreed or something, but it's peace in Dutch. And that was a really big thing for him as well. So he was a pacifist. He did join the army, I think, at first, but he later went on to become quite outspoken in the peace movement and encouraged conscientious objection. He was actually nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1937. I don't think he won the Nobel Peace Prize, but he was nominated for it. Question for you both: if you were nominated for a Nobel Prize, would you accept, or would you throw it back where it belongs?
Well, again, given the last bit of your sentence there, I think
I love a leading question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of quite horrible people have got them in the past. So, Barack Obama and not, horrible is perhaps too strong. He's definitely kind of warmongers, but
I can't believe you would say that about Barack Obama. Our Messiah.
Our Messiah, yes. I think, I don't know. I mean, I would certainly have to think long and hard about it. I suspect that any kind of accolade like that would be something you'd have to look very into the fine detail.
Yeah.
I do find myself I know this isn't, but when the knighthoods and all the various British stuff come, I always look at the Wikipedia page of people who have refused knighthoods and stuff, and I say,
it's much better reading, isn't it? Than
I'd love to be on that list, but I can't imagine I'll ever get offered it in any time soon. But yeah, Nobel Peace Prize, I probably would just throw it back in my face and throw it back in their face, and make a TikTok video about it, perhaps, and then let everyone else know.
I wonder if it's like with a knighthood, where they say that the best thing is if you can turn it down and it gets out to the media, so you look cool, but it's not you who's leaked it.
Yeah,
that's the best way.
So you still get clout, is what you're saying.
Yeah. What about you, Jonny? Would you accept?
I have never even considered it, so I doubt I'll ever receive anything like that in my life.
Bringing peace to North Norfolk.
I mean, it would be a real task. It's a bit of a shit answer, but the same as Ollie, really. I'd have to really think about that and weigh everything up. Possibly not. But it's also what benefit it would do for other people as well, which would be more of the thing. So I knew someone who worked for quite a good homeless shelter, still is, and he ummed and ahed whether he would receive an OBE or whatever it was, and eventually received it because it was good for the charity that was working for the shelter that he was working with, or not shelter, but the organisation he worked with, rather than for himself. So that's kind of where I would be with it. Like, is it going to benefit others? If not, probably not.
Aren't there subdivisions of this? Or am I thinking like Nobel Prize for chemistry, Nobel Prize for other things, but then the Nobel Peace Prize is its own thing, isn't it? Yeah, okay.
I don't know because I know that the Nobel Peace Prize, they make the medal out of the metal of a cannon or something that I think that's what it is, something like that. That Alfred Nobel had, I don't know, got from some, because he, how he made his money, was he was an arms dealer essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's, I think, where they make the medals from. But I don't know if that's the case. I've kind of assumed that that's only the case for the Peace Prize, because nothing says peace like a cannon. Although I suppose you are breaking it up, so
Would you, Adam?
No. Oh, fuck that. I don't want any. I frankly, and look, none of us can see into the future, right? So I want to leave myself some wriggle room for when I am, inevitably offered a Nobel Peace Prize. But I think, yeah, for me, I would not be accepting it. I'd probably turn it down fairly vociferously. I don't particularly want any kind of state, especially state kind of sanctioned recognition or awards or anything. I get the argument that, well, if it helps such and such organization, and we had Chris Howson on here who got a British Empire medal. Chris is probably I think our most, I was going to say most common guest, but you know what I mean by that.
Yeah.
And
Most frequent.
he got a British Empire medal. Most frequent, yeah, and also common. But no, I do get the argument that if it helps the organization, and that's what Chris Howson said as well. I just don't think I'd be able to bring myself to accept that kind of honor without vomiting in the direction of the person who gave it to me. Anyway, so back to what we're actually talking about. So Edo Fimon was a trade unionist. He was a peace activist. He was General Secretary of the International Transport Workers Federation for 13 years, so that's quite a while. And he was very involved in sort of trying to foster internationalism. So, yeah, pretty cool guy. Very much influenced by his faith. As I say, edited a bunch of Christian stuff, including Christian Anarchist magazine piece, and all round seems like a pretty good guy. So yeah, that's our Saint of the Week for this week, Edo Fimon. I'm sorry I didn't give it as in-depth a treatment as Ben would have, but we're dealing with what we're dealing with. So
Saint of the Week.
Let's move on to talk a little bit about how we can think about epistemology in terms of our faith as well. Because one of the things that, when we think about, say, a Marxist theory of knowledge, we talk about sort of dialectical materialism, one of the things that we have to differentiate between is a materialist way of thinking and an idealist way of thinking. And often we get caught up in, as Christians, in kind of idealist ways of thinking. Do you think there are ways that we can try and use a Marxist epistemology to try and undo some of that? How can that inform our faith? How can that help us to make better decisions about who we're listening to? And how can, what I'm really asking is, how do we know who's bullshitting us?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and one in which I've had numerous conversations with people in my church just down the road. And funnily enough, the vicar is a guy, Neil. He's very he reminds me very much of you, Adam. He's very kind of clearly on the left, and but kind of struggling a little bit with this hierarchy and the issues of the church itself. And
it doesn't sound like me at all, to be honest.
No, you find them really easy.
Yeah,
I love it. Hierarchy is my favorite. Yeah,
all this, these deference is perfectly natural. But no, he comes from an art history background, and he does a lot of. So whenever he's a very visual guy, and he's very dyslexic as well, actually, and he sort of uses a lot of paintings and visual art in trying to describe some of these ideas. And he grew up in this area, but he spent a lot of his time in Uganda. We have a partnership with a church out in Uganda. So a lot of the images he shows are obviously kind of Black Jesus and some of the African or indigenous depictions of faith or of Jesus and biblical stories more broadly. And to me, that is kind of at least an attempt to try and break out of the shackles of a sort of slightly idealist version of Christian thinking, which has kind of got locked up in, for want of a better phrase, or perhaps controversially, white supremacy. This sort of whiteness of Jesus and everything else, and I think that something as simple as that, something as simple as, perhaps not the right word again, but it's a word. Something as kind of simple as depicting Jesus as non-white, or trying to suggest that there are other versions of Christian faiths which exist outside of the Western canon, plays into a part of that material understanding insofar as that it's the human's conditions and the different cultures that we have built up all over the world over time which refracts the ideal or the spiritual through that. And I think and this is where the conversations and the various theological discussions I have with Neil end up. It's like, well, what is it that's being refracting here? Is it is it just another material condition? Is it some sort of absolute divinity, or is it a kind of human consciousness? I mean, that's obviously where the faith comes in. But ultimately, I think that you can make a play about the various indigenous cultures that depict Jesus as an evidence that there is a material, or at least a sort of differentiated materialism to what we consider to be the ethos of everyone's Christian faith, which is, divinity itself. So yeah, that to me is one way of thinking about it, thinking about the variations of how Christian cultures exist around the world.
I'd want to add to that, actually, of the sort of material things. Even if you look at Holy Communion and the actual elements themselves of bread and wine, you can easily make an argument that it's Christo-fascism to say it has to be bread and glutinous bread, and it has to be wine, alcoholic wine, and ignoring the fact that the expression of that meal, or that Thanksgiving meal, could be different elements. I mean, the fact that you have to say it has to be these things rather than allowing for any variance. Methodist Church, we're a bit more lax on that. It has to be alcohol free. It's not allowed alcohol on the premises anyway. But we
fascist. Can't have it one way and not the other, Jonny.
No, it's okay, Adam, because it's done in the name of equality, so it's fine. But we're less prescriptive, but there's still, as you say, Adam, in a serious way, it still has to be alcohol free, but it still has to be fruit of the vine, and it needs to be bread. So even then, it still can't be expressed in other ways if there are different cultures, different understandings of the world, different material realities and experiences.
Which is a real problem, actually. From I did a lot on post-colonial hermeneutics and liturgies and that kind of thing for my masters, and it's a real problem, a practical material problem, that we think about it in those ways, because we're using a grain from the Levant to make the thing that we have decided that must be. And when you transport that to a part of the world where that grain certainly didn't exist and perhaps struggles to grow, and it's expensive and that kind of thing, and you say to those people, well, okay, you have rice and you want to make your bread out of rice, but that's not good enough because Jesus used wheat. It has to be wheaten bread. I just think that that's a colonial mindset, and B, it just completely misses the point. And so often
Absolutely.
We completely miss the point of what Jesus is getting at and what the gospel is, for these kind of very strict ways of thinking. And it's interesting because I'm trying to talk about a materialist dialectic, and it's leading me to more diversity, less certainty. And I think this is where we start to get into the places where, say, a Marxist and a postmodern kind of approach start to have those conversations, which I find very interesting.
Deleuze is really interested in difference and newness and things like that. And I'm currently have been working on for a while now, actually, of talking about communion, and a sort of sexual intimacy, and using that sort of hermeneutic of consent to understand what happens at communion, but also throwing in there, I've been thinking about it and how difference and newness relate to God, and relating it to Moltmann and how he understands God and how God can change. And I think that works really quite well. So it allows an idea for an expression of or understanding of God to be contextual, and the sort of Missio Dei, the activity of God in the world, to be contextual. So instead of having a kind of real strong hierarchy of, for example, saying it has to be bread and wine, or wheaten bread and wine for the elements of the Eucharist, you can say, well, actually, no, God is contextual, therefore the Eucharist can be contextual. And it allows an opening to different experiences and different understandings as well, beyond the kind of, very post-Enlightenment colonialist input.
Are you familiar with Alain Badiou's work? Because Alain Badiou is another sort of French continental philosopher he's still alive, actually. He's kind of in his 90s now.
Oh, is he? I didn't realize he was still alive.
But I think that Alain Badiou's work is interesting because, I mean, I'm not particularly on board with a lot of what he says, but he is very clear that this newness that you've just talked about is a quality of an event, a rupture in the world, which only comes about through various criteria that are met, but the meeting of that criteria is not at the time. It happens through a kind of fidelity to the event. And so he says that there's various events that he can point to over time. So in politics, for example, you've got the French Revolution. In science, you've got the apple on Galileo's head. And these are such important events because they change everything about the state of that situation. And arguably the French Revolution still is changing the state of... But anyway, what he talks about as the ultimate event is the resurrection of Christ, because without that event, there is no modern world. There is no... Because the entirety of the last 2,000 years of the modern world is dependent upon the truth of that event. And so his argument is that is the ultimate truth. And therefore, if it's the ultimate truth, then God in that respect is immutable. And I think that's the distinction that he makes difference to Deleuze, is that God is immutable. It is the only immutable we can ever think of. We can't even hope to experience it, but we can only ever think of. And everything else around that is contextual and has contextualizations, but that's the only immutable in the universe is God, or whatever kind of conceptualization of God you want to choose, nirvana, faith, whatever, fate, whatever it want to be. And so that only ever exposes itself in these events, in these ruptures, ultimately in the resurrection of Christ, but in the political realm, in something like the French Revolution or the Chinese Revolution, or in the scientific realm, or in love. He talks about some Greek, Abelard, and anyway, I forget which one it is. And so there are various arenas of that truth event. Anyway, so I just find Badiou stuff is really interesting. A sort of counterpoint to Deleuze when it comes to that theorization.
That's helpful. And I still disagree and push back against Badiou, because the way I can understand love, I quite like Richard Gilman Opalski's book, The Communism of Love. And he talks about love as being involved in someone's becoming what they are not yet. I think that's the quote in the book. And in order to be involved with someone's becoming and then being involved with your becoming, because there's an element of reciprocity, there's got to be an element of becoming in God as well, I think, because you can't be involved with someone and love them without being changed yourself. And even like with language, I'm not bilingual or multilingual by any means, but those who I know who are, they almost, when they start speaking a different language, they almost need to change the sort of almost the cultural mindset in their brain in order to start thinking and speaking in that language. And it's almost like, there is a change, a difference in that person in order to do so. And surely there is in God as well, when God interacts with us in whatever way that looks like. So those two things are quite, and obviously Moltmann's ideas about the crucifixion and God changing and all that stuff.
No, I think that's a good way of putting it. But yeah, it's just an interesting way of kind of understanding this stuff.
Yeah, no, I'll look into that and then use it as saying, Badiou says this and I disagree.
Just quickly, the other book on love. Have you read Shreko Horvat's The Radicality of Love? It's a fantastic book. I can thoroughly recommend it. It's anyway. Sorry, Adam.
We completely fine. It's an interesting divergence. I think we are heading towards the end now, but I want to bring us back a little bit to the pipeline, the rabbit hole. We were talking about something earlier where we were talking about how difficult it is to have conversations with people who are at some point down the rabbit hole. And I suspect that for people who do escape that eventually, it takes a lot of people, especially those who are close to them, saying, I think you're down the rabbit hole, for it to gradually sink in and for you to start to think, maybe I am down the rabbit hole. Maybe this isn't quite. And it is a battle of narratives, really. If you are someone who has been told this and you start to think, maybe there's something to this, maybe I am down the rabbit hole, particularly if you're someone with a Christian faith as well, how can epistemology, how can different theories of knowledge, but also a sort of Marxist theory of knowledge, how can this stuff help us to move forward to try and learn where we really might actually be at, to maybe try and get ourselves out of that rabbit hole, particularly without it destroying our faith? Because I think one of the issues is that we're talking about very literalistic thinking, very binary ways of presenting facts or indeed fictions. And when the opposite threatens your worldview, threatens your faith, that can be a really hard place to be. So how can epistemology help us get out of the rabbit hole without destroying our faith?
I think so. Just to break it up a little bit, to break the question up, I think that the epistemologies of this rabbit hole, or the red pilling, or whatever the phrase you use, it is a sort of a conflation of fact and fiction, and so you have to deliberately muddy that binary in order to put people on this journey. And so if you're coming out of that, then it is a realization that the narrative that you have been told, or the reasons that you have been told for why your life is so shit, is a lie, or it doesn't represent the kinds of realities that you have subsequently experienced. And so building that back up into something which doesn't just represent nihilism is going to be really, really tough, because if you sort of suddenly realize that your world, all the reasons that you thought for why your life was shit, that, you know, the immigrants are coming over on boats, or women are just these horrible gold digging people, or whatever it is, if you suddenly realize that's not true, then you're scrabbling around for a reason as to why these things exist. And so you could just fall onto another, I'm going to use untruth, I don't mean that, but another sort of constructed reality. If you have a faith, then I think that there's a real risk of that falling into that kind of breaking up. And I guess you just have to be very careful to delineate, or when someone is coming off that pipeline or coming out of it, you have to be very careful to them to say, well, there are parts of your reality which were affected by this lie, but there are other parts of it which weren't. And I fall back to this conversation I had with my student, because this guy who she was talking to, he was incredibly red-pilled, and she was saying that the moment she mentions Andrew Tate, he kind of all got very defensive, but he was very much kind of saying, no, I want to stay here with my mother in this house, and he just had a baby, he's just with his wife, and so he was kind of, you know, it wasn't the traditional sort of nuclear family setup, but he was very much like, I love my mother, I don't want her to be lonely. That was what the phrase that they were using. I don't want her to be lonely. And so there's a sense of care in that. There was a real sense of sort of, you know, care, familial, philia, not necessarily agape, but a real kind of sense of love, which seems to be very contradictory to the kinds of ideas that Andrew Tate and everyone else puts forward. And so there can be these multiple truths existing in these pipelines. And so, you know, it was just a conversation I had with them. I don't know how it kind of ends up, but ultimately in that situation, and I'm assuming in others as well, that you can actually try and distinguish between the kinds of things that are important and constructive, such as the love for your mother and the desire for her not to be lonely, and all this other shit, which is just kind of poisoning the well. And so you have to kind of make sure that you don't completely obliterate all their worldview in one go. I'm sorry, everything you've been told is a lie, mate. I'm sorry. Let's start from the beginning again. Whereas you just have to kind of deconstruct it a little bit. And finally, I think on Twitter, there's a load of TikTok. There's a whole load of people whom I follow who, you know, they make their thing is like, oh, I've been deconstructed out of the evangelical kind of prosperity gospel sort of thing, and they go through their journeys and say it took me a long time to actually say, well, no, this bit's good, this bit's bad, this bit's good, this bit's bad. And so they still have a faith, but it's very different to what it was. And so they talk about these, it's actually quite a long process to defragment the different bits of the narrative which they've been told. Yeah, therapy, I guess. I mean, there's lots of different ways.
I was just going to say, it sounds like therapy. In transactional analysis, which is one of my favorite models of personality, but also it's a psychotherapy as well, the idea of scripts. So we form scripts as a child and we live them out, and it's to do with our values, how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive others, and the sort of interactions we get, and we do things to sort of reaffirm that script. That's the idea. And I wonder if that idea of script could be quite helpful in starting to understand where people are at in terms of their understandings of the world and what messages are being reinforced, but also obviously what their life experience is and what they're going through and how that kind of interacts. I suppose with your idea, Ollie, of where things are taking place, it's those different systems interacting with one another, isn't it? And what's underlying those things. It's a cause and effect that are happening at the same time, as it were.
Yeah, right. And just as you were talking there, I mean, it reminded me of the 12-point plan. Is it 12-point plan that Alcoholics Anonymous put in place?
Yeah.
Similar kind of, I mean, deconstructing your dependence on addiction on a substance. So there's lots of sort of off-the-shelf tools, I guess, that can be applied quite well to these kinds of things, because ultimately, it's cult behavior in many respects.
To finish up, I wanted to talk a little bit about Novara Media and Ash Sarkar, who have been, it's died off a little bit now, but they've been doing the rounds, kind of pointing to a way of thinking about politics and Marxism that some might argue is erring on the side of a sort of class reductionist way of thinking about things, and certainly pointing a little bit of a finger at certainly identity politics, if not a sort of more left-wing intersectionality. And you recently wrote a blog, The Limits of Marx in the Age of Trumpian Christo-Fascism, that I think is kind of instructive on that kind of stuff and maybe could offer a kind of counterpoint to that.
Yeah, I found Ash Sarkar's stuff kind of difficult to square, largely because I've always been very happy that she's been around, insofar as I've always thought she's spoken truth to power very articulately and very well over the last few years. But this was interesting, but that blog in particular, I think, came out of a kind of frustration that the traditional Marxist critiques were weren't cutting it when it comes to what was happening in Trump's America, and it just the sort of, particularly around what Bezos and Zuckerberg have been doing. These are in many respects quite anti-capitalist moves. And they're sort of feudal, and they're kind of aristocratic lords back in the day. It's sort of like Yanis Varoufakis' new book, was it Techno-Feudalism?
Techno-Feudalism, yeah.
It's perhaps a good way to describe what's happening there. Although, there are some issues with that. So I think that when it comes to thinking about the onset of this sort of Christo-fascism, which is arising in the United States, then we have to make sure that we understand that race, sexuality, ability, disability and ability, everything else, queer, neurodivergence, they all play a part in this class makeup. It's intersectional. I mean, it's we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. This class first approach ignores the fact that class itself as a construct is made up of race and everything else. And these are constructed concepts alongside class. And so it was an attempt to try and resituate a lot of this debate to say, well, look, because Trump has shifted the meta-narrative from kind of turbocharged neoliberal late capitalism to Christo-fascism, then the critique has to move with it. And that requires understanding that the targets of fascism, particularly Trump's fascism, then it's not a sort of profit motive. It's eschatological. They're trying to usher in the end of the world. That is what these people are doing. That's what fascism does. That's their timeline. Fascists, if to be very reductive about it, like the left want to open up history, or the future, sorry. The left want to open it up for everybody. Capitalists want it to stay exactly the same, to sort of capitalist realism. But fascists want it to end. And they want it to come to a point. And very clearly with the rapture, and this is why the Zionists are sort of align with the Christo-fascists so neatly, because they want all the pawns in place for Christ's return in Israel. This is exactly what this project is all about. For fascists, future is coming to, so some sort of apocalypse is coming towards them, and they have to be ready. And so this doesn't, the critiques of that, Marx's sort of class first capitalist will only get us so far. And so you need to understand that these fascists don't construct society around this traditional class model. They construct it around a white supremacist, heteronormative class model. And that has identity politics firmly in the critique. And so, which is why I was a little bit upset with Ash Sarkar, because it's basically just trying to, it's trying to kind of hold on to a kind of traditional class Marxist critique, when I just don't think that cuts to the heart of the matter anymore. And just briefly at the end, this is why I think that the this pipeline stuff is one of the kind of critiques that people such as Labour MPs and even Gareth Southgate, when he gave that quite a good speech last night or the other night, maybe not Gareth Southgate, but maybe he didn't say it, but there was other people that said, oh, well, it's the woke mob and woke overreach, which has caused these people to, young men to react. But ultimately, the material conditions of the lack of sure start and the fact that there's just been complete gutting of the public services of the last 20 years has far more of an impact on people's lives and their decisions to run to Andrew Tate than some feminist on Twitter. So I think that to claim that it's some sort of woke outreach or overreach is a little bit reductive, and I think that ignores some of the sort of basic understandings of austerity and what this has done to our, the generation of children that are being affected by this. So, that's my issue was with that particular debate.
I think it's one of those things as well about recognizing the difference between, a sort of leftist intersectionality and a culture war, right? The right wing started a culture war. They want a culture war, and we need to sidestep that culture war, I think, and sort of say, actually, these things aren't up for debate, but we do actually need to look at these intersections in a materialist way and recognize, that austerity has really had an awful effect on these people. It's I liked it because it sort of, it's not saying that Marxism or materialism has nothing to say about that. It's saying that we open it up, which I appreciate.
Yeah, that's kind of been my point for a while. I mean, the latest book, the 7 Ethics Against Capitalism book, which, by the way, the last chapter on love is in which I kind of have my sort of Christianist sort of manifesto almost. But opening it up is really, really important because because it's such vital. I mean, the mechanics of those critiques are important, but you just have to kind of, it's a moving target to some degree. I mean, so we have to kind of just adapt those critiques to counter the horrific horribleness that Trump is espousing at the moment.
Yeah. Oli, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to let us know where people can find you and maybe let people know a little bit about what each of your books are about? Any stuff you want to plug, anything like that?
You want me to advertise myself? You want me to be a marketer?
Absolutely, yeah. Do the marketing bit.
Okay, so on social media is at Oli Mould, OLIMOULD. I'm on Blue Sky and TikTok, I guess, are the two main ones. I've got a few books out. My blog is Tacity, Tacity, CACITY, tacity.co.uk. And there's a list of all my books there, which there's 3 books at the moment. I've got one coming out later this year about post-capitalist cities. Just check out that and send me an email or to send me a comment or a DM or something, and we can have a chat.
My brain read it as TA City, as in like territorial army city for some reason.
No. Well, I've never heard that before. No, it's Tacit. Yeah, Tacit.
Yeah, thank goodness. Thank goodness that's what it is, and not where my brain went.
With the TA. I'm not Gareth from The Office. No.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us. We really do.
Yes,
appreciate
very,
it, and we'll
Thank you very
definitely-
much.
I've
definitely have
thoroughly
you on
enjoyed
again.
it. Thank you.
Johnny, where can people find you? Are you still basically
I am
nowhere,
in North Norfolk, the most
or...
rural part of
turn
England.
up to North Norfolk and see if you can find Johnny. Johnny's the only person in North Norfolk with blue hair,
There are a couple.
and you all know each other.
Yeah, basically.
You can find me at most places, Blue Sky, TikTok, other places, at Commie XIAN. I've also just written an article for Shibboleth magazine that touches on some of the stuff we've been talking about today. So yeah, have a look at that when the next issue comes out. In fact, subscribe now and get 5 issues for whatever the price is, because it's great to support new left-wing Christian media. So Shibboleth magazine is worth a look. You can find the podcast, you probably already know this if you're listening to it, let's be honest, but you can find the podcast at breadandrosaries.com. You can email us, breadandrosaries@gmail.com. We are on the X, the Everything app. We probably will get rid of that and go on Blue Sky at some point. I just haven't got around to it. But yeah, go and follow us, have a look. We've got blogs and stuff too. And thank you so much for joining us. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.